I think that the pressure is now intense on Rishi, and suddenly the bets are off on a long distance campaign, in other words, until November. If the polling is really as dire on May the 2nd as we expect, and lots of seats are lost, and more of those resignations. And what I suspect is that there are people who are putting their names into the chairman of the 1922 committee. And while we don't know the numbers exactly, they are growing. It's a very close run thing, but it is possible to see a summer election if Rishi Sunak simply thinks, well, if I'm going to head off a challenge, I might as well go now.
Sunday Times published the results of a new survey which suggests the Tories will suffer the worst electoral defeat in history, retaining just 98 MPs. It says Labour is set to sweep to power with a majority of 286 and expects the results to reignite efforts by Tories plotting to topple the Prime Minister. On Times Radio Breakfast this morning, Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and Britain's top pollster, spoke about the threat posed by reform.
Remember, the Brexit Party did not stand in Conservative-held constituencies back in 2019. So even if Reform are not doing anything like the 12% they're currently at in the opinion polls in most instances, that means they're particularly going to do damage to the Tories in seats that the Tories are trying to defend.
Baroness Hayter, as a Labour peer, you must be delighted with this survey.
I have to say it did rather make my Easter. It was a toss up between that and the chocolate bunny that my grandchildren had given me, which was the best news of the day. But yes, on the other hand, we are warned again and again. This is only a poll; it's not the real thing, and there's always the feeling. Which I think came back from Tony Blair's early days, didn't it? It's like carrying the Ming vase across a polished floor. Even if these polls now are correct, one has to be very careful not to take them for granted, but also to realise that the most important thing is what people will actually do when the election actually happens. But I'm afraid, yes, it was not as great surprise. Those of us who've been out canvassing have heard similar regret, really, about the wasted 14 years, if you like. If the government's been in all these years, why are things now so bad? So a bit of me is not that surprised by this polling.
Ed Vase, mean that the polls will close, do you think? Or do you think that they're going to stick at the 20-point kind of area?
What we have to remember is we're talking about a national average, and what I'm seeing on the ground is an enormous range, a huge swing away from the Tories, certainly, and I'm seeing that right across the board, but also not very much satisfaction with Labour. What I'm focused on is the next generation of Green MPs, getting those elected as we can around the country. And what I'm finding, seats like North Herefordshire, seats like Waveney Valley in Suffolk and parts of Norfolk, we're finding on the doorstep many people who say, well, I voted for it all my life, but I'm not going to do it now. And in those places, they're very much coming to us. What we do know is coming is the local elections on the 2nd of May. And if you look at the graph, I only tweeted it this morning, in the last 4 or 5 years, the number of Green councillors is actually growing exponentially. And, we're going to see more of that, I have absolutely no doubt, on May 2. And we'll take over more councils, be running more things. And just because Tory and Labour have been the two largest parties for a century doesn't mean that's necessarily going to continue in the future.
Let's just bring Trevor Kavannagh here from The Sun, if we can. Trevor, when you look at this poll, one thing kind of stuck out to me in the fact that there are 15% of people who are still completely undecided. And many on the Labour side think that the fact that there is 15% undecided, they probably would have already switched to Labour if they were going that way right now. So where those 15% go is so key to the turnout of this election, isn't it?
Yes, I think that everybody's right. This is just a snapshot, but it is also the same snapshot that we've seen over the last few weeks and indeed months. So it's not just a snapshot, it's a running theme. It's like an awful continuous line on a hospital monitor of a seriously ill patient. And I think that one of the problems here is that people aren't just going to switch to another party, although many will. They might go to Green, they might go to Reform, they might go to Labour. But I think the Tories' biggest problem is those who will not vote at all. They'll simply stay home. And they've made their mind up on this over very considerable number of months. I mean, they say that election decisions are made 6 months out from polling day. And I think that that is what has happened. We had a poll for The Sun last week on Saturday, Friday, Saturday, and it showed that people have made their minds up one way or the other. They are simply not going to change back to the Tories or away from Labour. And I think our readership is pretty much representative of the opinion polls we're seeing today. And our readers traditionally have been the sort of keynote voters who not decide elections, but tend to be the indicator, the key indicator.
But Trevor, how much of that will change by, the constant criticism that we hear that we don't know enough about what Labour stand for, and when some of what they do stand for is put to the test, for example, changes to business rules when it comes to, clamping down on workers' rights, that actually they fray a little bit around the edges. Could that not shorten things and change things in the next 6 months?
It might do, but it would have to be quite substantial and significant before any real resonance is felt or heard across the polling results. I think that this is a case of the Tories losing votes. It's not a question of people shifting positively towards Labour. Labour is not a particularly attractive option here, nor indeed is the Green Party after the I think net zero fiasco, which I think is beginning to unravel at the seams. So this is almost entirely a judgment on 14 years of Tory rule. It is not an endorsement of Labour. And one of the things that I think Labour is going to have to contend with, as and when it wins this resounding majority, is coping with that majority, because the Labour Party is not a united organisation. It is not a united front. It is deeply divided. There are still quite a few people who speak for the hard left within the party and who will speak up once the government is in office, if we assume Labour is going to win, which I do. And I think that that will be a very uncomfortable position for Keir Starmer at a time when things aren't necessarily going the way he would want them on the economy and other issues.
Well, let's let Labour come back on that. Baroness Hayter, what do you make of what Trevor just said there? Because there is an interesting story in The Observer today suggesting that the Labour Party's seen a drop of more than 23,000 members following controversies over Gaza and your U-turn on green investment.
Well, there's two things. One is our membership is still, pretty high compared with historical figures. But the other thing is we also know, and I've been involved in the Labour Party now at national level for about 40, 50 years, is actually there's very, very little correlation between our membership of the party and votes as they turn out. So I'm not very worried about the drop in membership. I think the other issue is that actually, of course, there'll always be some people around the edge of any party that are not at the very centre and heart of it. But actually, I find the Labour Party as united, or probably more united, than almost any time through my 50 years odd. And it's mostly because we can see what's going wrong and we can see the priorities for where action is taken. And that is about the health service, and it is about jobs, and it is about education. And actually, there's no difference across the party over those priorities. They will be difficult. I think if I was going to say what are the problems for Labour, I think it's much more how do you turn around, the ship of state, if you like, particularly health and education, that take a long time either to get new teachers into the classroom or even more to rebuild the schools, that program we had in 2010 that was cancelled, or get more doctors and nurses into hospitals. Even if we win, I think it's going to be the 17th of October, but there you are. Even if we were to win and go into number 10 on the 18th of October, these things take years. So I think our issue and Keir's issue, if he goes into number 10, will be much more people will want change in services that they see locally, and it will take a bit of time to do. So I think it's going to be managing that's an issue, much bigger than some peripheral people on the party, who I think will be very small in number, because we're jolly united. We want better services, but also we want more honesty in politics. And I think Keir is seen as offering that.
Yeah.
I think that integrity is there. It may not excite everybody, but I think is a sort of a solidarity and a safeness to it.
What about you, Baroness Bennett? Should the Greens be getting more of a bounce in these polls than we've actually been seeing? Because you haven't really been pulling up to some of these losses elsewhere, have you? I mean, those 23,000 people who've left the Labour Party, I assume you'd be hoping they'd come over to you, but the people who are really shooting up in the polls are Reform, aren't they?
I think we're seeing polling of the like we've never seen before outside an election period, and comparable to the 2015 general election, when we got more votes than we got in every general election added together previously. But I think what we're seeing, reflecting the Labour situation, we are seeing significant numbers of people, indeed some councillors, and there may be more on the way coming from the Labour Party to join us. And Gaza is a huge issue for many communities. And we're also, of course, the £28 billion, the disappearing £28 billion of green investment. But there's also so many other issues. The 2-child benefit limit, something that throws children into poverty. The refusal to say they're going to back a cap on bankers' bonuses. This is not a signal of change. This is a signal of more of the same. And so what we're seeing is that shift. But also, I think it's really important to stress that we, inevitably national newspapers look at the national figures, but what we're seeing on the ground is real shifts on the ground in places where people have elected Green councillors, really like what they see, and are electing more and more Greens. And that's what we'll be seeing on May 2, and what we'll also be seeing with the next generation of Green MPs within the general election, whenever it comes. And for what it's worth, I think Rishi Sunak finds it very hard to make up his mind. So my bet is January.
Here we are. I would agree with Ed Vaizey up to a point, but I think that the pressure is now intense on Rishi, and suddenly the bets are off on a long distance campaign, in other words, until November. If the polling is really as dire on May the 2nd as we expect, and lots of seats are lost, and more of those resignations. I mean, Robert Halfon was one of the most respected of the Tory front bench, and to lose someone of his stature and endurance, and I think integrity, is a major blow to the government. Even though he expressed his full support for Rishi Sunak, and what I suspect is that there are people who are putting their names into the chairman of the 1922 committee, and while we don't know the numbers exactly, they are growing. It's a very close-run thing, but it is possible to see a summer election if Rishi Sunak simply thinks, well, if I'm going to head off a challenge, I might as well go now.
Might as well go to California for the summer. Yeah. Okay. Right. Lots of you getting in contact on this. Thank you for your text and WhatsApps. Lisa has WhatsApped. I agree with Trevor and would add that I think Starmer's biggest opposition will eventually come from the seats behind him and not the divided party opposite. This one has come in without a name on the text. The triple locked, newly taxed pensioners probably won't even vote Conservative now because they can finally see that they've been stitched up too. Welcome to the club.